Captain Maya Torres stepped off the Chinook into the Afghan dust, her M110 SAS rifle case secured across her back alongside 60 pounds of gear. The forward operating base sprawled across the valley floor, a maze of HESCO barriers and plywood structures baking under the midday sun. She deployed twice before to this region, knew the mountains held secrets that intelligence reports never quite captured. The briefing tent stood at the compound's center, its canvas sides rippling in the hot wind. Torres moved toward it with the easy confidence of someone who'd earned her place through 2,000 hours of trigger time and more patience than most people possessed in their entire lives. Back home in Colorado, the mountains had taught her to read terrain like other people read books, and these Afghan peaks spoke the same language with a different accent. Inside the tent, Lieutenant Commander Brad Kessler studied a satellite map with 3 other SEALs, their conversation stopping when she entered. His eyes tracked from her Marine Corps insignia to the rifle case, his jaw tightening in a way that told her everything she needed to know before he spoke. Request denied. He'd written to JSOC 2 weeks ago when Torres's attachment orders came through. His team didn't need a diversity hire, slowing them down on a time-critical operation. The response from Colonel Sarah Vance had been brief and absolute. Captain Torres is the most qualified sniper available for this terrain and mission profile, period. Kessler straightened from the map, his posture radiating the kind of authority that came from 10 years leading men in the worst places on Earth. Captain Torres, I'm told you're here for Overwatch support on tomorrow's operation. Yes, sir, Torres replied, setting her case down with care that spoke to the precision instrument inside. I've reviewed the initial brief and have some questions about the terrain analysis. The 3 SEALs behind Kessler exchanged glances. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, the team's senior enlisted, showed no expression, but Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison's smirk carried enough contempt for all of them. The third man, a quiet operator named Chun, simply watched. We have the terrain handled, Kessler said, turning back to his map. Your position will be here, 800 meters from the target village, providing overwatch while the team executes the capture operation. Torres moved closer to study the map, noting the ridgeline Kessler had marked. That position offers limited coverage of the northern approach. If I move to this elevation instead, I can cover 3 of the 4 ingress routes and maintain line of sight on the compound. The overwatch position isn't negotiable, Kessler said without looking up. The mission brief is complete. Morrison leaned against the support pole, his arms crossed. Must be nice getting attached to SEAL operations, playing operator without doing the selection. Webb's voice cut through the tense, stale air. Morrison shut it. His eyes met Torres's for a moment, something like respect flickering there before he returned to examining the compound layout. Torres had heard variations of Morrison's comment in a dozen different forms over 8 years in the Corps. The words stopped bothering her somewhere around year 3, replaced by the simple understanding that her rifle spoke louder than any argument she could make with her mouth. Let them doubt. The mountains would teach them what she already knew. The briefing proceeded with Kessler outlining the mission. 3 high-value targets meeting in a fortified compound, intelligence suggesting they be present between 0300 and 0500 hours. The team would insert by helicopter 2 kilometers out, move on foot through the mountain passes, and establish positions before dawn. Quick capture, immediate extract, wheels up before sunrise. Torres noted the gaps in his plan, the assumptions about enemy strength and positioning that relied too heavily on intelligence reports that were already 4 days old. In the Sanjin Valley, during her second deployment, she'd learned that 4 days in Afghanistan meant everything could change. Enemy fighters moved like water through these mountains, flowing into spaces the maps showed as empty. After the briefing, Torres made her way to the armory to prep her equipment. The M110 required meticulous care, each component checked and rechecked until muscle memory and precision merged into ritual. She was cleaning the bolt carrier group when Morrison appeared in the doorway, his shadow falling across her workspace. He walked past, close enough that his shoulder bumped her rifle case, sending it sliding across the table. The crash of metal on concrete echoed through the small space. Sorry, Morrison said without turning around, his tone making clear he wasn't. Torres caught the case before it hit the floor, checking the scope alignment with practiced efficiency. The Leopold Mark IV showed no damage, but she'd verify 0 on the range before mission launch anyway. No point trusting anything when lives hung on quarter-inch accuracy at 1,000 meters. Webb entered as Morrison left, the two men passing without acknowledgement. The chief moved to Torres's bench, examining her weapon layout with the eye of someone who understood the difference between good enough and perfect. "Don't mind Morrison," Webb said quietly. "He's got issues that aren't about you." Torres continued her inspection, running a patch through the barrel. "Everyone's got issues, Chief. Question is whether they let those issues compromise the mission." Webb nodded slowly. "You deployed to Helmand in 2012, right?" "I was with 3rd Marines running artillery support in Marja. Worked with a female fire direction officer who knew her math better than anyone in the battalion. Watched people dismiss her calculations until she started landing rounds danger close with 0 errors. After that, people shut up and listened." Torres met his eyes, recognizing an ally when she found one. "Math doesn't care about opinions, Chief. Neither do bullets." That evening, she studied the terrain maps in her assigned bunk space, a plywood cubicle that smelled of dust and diesel fuel. The satellite imagery showed details Kessler's brief had glossed over: 3 ridgelines with clear firing positions, a dry riverbed that could hide a platoon, elevation changes that would affect ballistics in ways the standard calculations didn't account for. She plotted 3 optimal sniper positions, each offering better coverage than the spot Kessler had assigned her. The mission brief had mentioned time-critical intelligence, a meeting of commanders that JSOC had been tracking for 3 months. What it hadn't mentioned was why 3 separate high-value targets would choose this specific village in this specific valley. Torres had learned to ask questions that briefings didn't answer, and this one had several. She cleaned her weapon one more time, each motion automatic, her mind already in those mountains calculating wind and distance and 1,000 variables that separated a good shot from a wasted bullet. Somewhere watching right now, maybe someone from the mountain states understood this kind of preparation, knew how terrain and patience shaped a person differently than flat ground and hurry ever could. Tomorrow the SEALs would see if their assumptions held up when the mountain started teaching lessons that briefings never covered. Torres would be ready either way, because the rifle didn't care about anyone's opinion of who held it, only whether that person knew how to make it speak with precision when speaking mattered most. The Blackhawks lifted off at 200 hours, their rotors beating the darkness into submission as they climbed toward the mountain pass. Torres sat in the second helicopter with 4 other personnel, separated from Kessler's team in the lead bird. Through the open door, she watched the valley fall away beneath them, the landscape rendered in shades of gray and black by her night vision equipment. The flight path would take them through a narrow canyon before depositing both teams at a landing zone 2 kilometers from the target village. Intelligence had marked the route as low risk, but Torres noted the ridgelines rising on either side, perfect positions for anyone who knew the helicopters would come this way. Afghan fighters had learned patience over decades of war, learned to wait in the cold darkness for targets that flew predictable paths. In the lead Blackhawk, Kessler's voice crackled over the team comm channel. "Everyone get back there? We'll be babysitting our Marine attachment tonight. Make sure nobody gets lost in the mountains." The comment drew chuckles from Morrison and Shun. Webb's silence spoke louder than any response. Torres adjusted her grip on the M110, her focus on the terrain below rather than the commentary above. She'd served 2 previous deployments, including the Sanjin Valley operation, where 3rd Battalion had lost 8 men to an ambush that intelligence had rated low risk. The difference between coming home and coming home in a box often came down to whether you trusted the briefing or trusted the ground. The canyon walls closed in as both helicopters descended, the pilots navigating by instruments and experience through the darkness. Torres felt the aircraft bank left, then right, following the natural curves of the terrain. Then the first rounds cracked past the fuselage, green tracers arcing up from a ridgeline that the intelligence brief had marked as unoccupied. Taking fire, the pilot announced with professional calm, his hands already responding. The Black Hawk jinxing sideways as more rounds stitched through the air where they'd been seconds before. Torres marked the muzzle flashes, counting at least 3 firing positions on the eastern ridge, maybe 400 meters above their current flight path. The intelligence brief hadn't mentioned enemy presence in this sector, which meant either the information was outdated or someone had repositioned since the last satellite pass. Neither option inspired confidence in what they'd find at the target village. The lead Black Hawk took sporadic hits, nothing critical, but enough to remind everyone that luck ran out when you stopped respecting the terrain. Both aircraft accelerated through the canyon, leaving the firing positions behind as they emerged into the wider valley beyond. Landing zone in 2 minutes, the pilot said. Torres mentally cataloged the encounter, adding it to the growing list of details that didn't match the confident briefing Kessler had delivered. Enemy fighters operating freely in areas marked as clear, firing positions that suggested advanced knowledge of flight paths, and somewhere ahead, a village that intelligence swore would contain 3 high-value targets meeting at precisely the right time for a perfect capture operation. The Blackhawks flared over the landing zone, a flat area of scrub and rock that offered minimal cover but good sight lines. Torres was third out, fast-tripping to the ground with her gear and weapons secured, her boots hitting the packed earth as both helicopters hovered overhead. The teams dispersed immediately, establishing a security perimeter while the birds climbed back into the darkness. Morrison moved away when Torres approached to establish their 2-person movement formation, leaving her standing alone while he joined Shin instead. The message was clear. She could follow along, but she wouldn't be integrated into their tactical organization. Kessler gathered the team at the edge of the LZ, his voice low in the mountain darkness. 3 kilometers to the objective, 400 meters of elevation gain. Morrison, you're on point. Chun, rear security. Webb, center. Torres, you're with the headquarters element at the back. Stay close and stay quiet. The implied message hung in the cold air. Stay out of the way. The team moved out along a goat trail that wound up the mountainside, their night vision turning the landscape into a green-tinted maze of rocks and shadows. Torres maintained position at the rear, watching the back trail and the ridgelines above them with equal attention. The mountains here felt wrong, too quiet for terrain that should hold shepherds and farmers and the normal life of a rural valley. At the JSOC Operations Center, 5,000 miles away, Colonel Sarah Vance watched the mission unfold on multiple screens, thermal imagery and communications feeds, painting a picture of the operation in progress. She'd selected Torres for this attachment personally, had pushed the assignment through despite Kessler's objections and the raised eyebrows from 3 different colonels who questioned the timing. Torres had the best performance metrics of any sniper in the Marine Corps, male or female, with verified kills at ranges that most operators couldn't achieve on a shooting range, much less under combat stress. More importantly, she had experience in this exact terrain, had spent 6 months in the Sanjin Valley learning how the mountains shape tactical situations in ways that briefings never captured. Vance watched the team's progress markers move up the mountain and wondered if Kessler's prejudice would cost lives before he learned what she already knew. Competence had no gender, only results. The trail steepened as the team climbed, the village appearing below them as a scattering of lights and darker structures against the valley floor. Kessler called a halt at a ridgeline overlook, the team dropping into defensive positions while he glassed the objective through thermal optics. Torres moved to the edge, studying the village through her own scope. The compound Kessler had marked as the target sat at the village center, 3 buildings arranged around a central courtyard. But what caught her attention were the rooftops, where thermal signatures suggested personnel in positions that offered overlapping fields of fire. Sir, Torres said quietly, moving toward Kessler. I'm seeing multiple heat signatures on elevated positions around the compound. At least 4, possibly more. Kessler continued his scan without responding for several seconds. Noted. Maintain position and let the operators work. Webb crouched nearby, his own assessment of the terrain reaching similar conclusions. "Commander, those positions concern me. If those are sentries, they've got good coverage of the approaches." "We have the element of surprise," Kessler replied, lowering his optics. "The targets don't know we're here. We move fast. We're in and out before anyone can organize a response." Torres returned to her position, her misgivings growing with each new detail. The fighters on the ridgeline during insertion, the defensive positions around the compound, the perfect timing that put high-value targets in a specific location at a specific time. In the Sanjin Valley, she'd learned to recognize the shape of a trap, and this situation was beginning to look familiar. The team moved down toward the village, Torres counting 12 thermal signatures now, then 15 as more became visible with changing angles of observation. These weren't farmers sleeping through the night or sentries fighting boredom on a routine watch. These were personnel in deliberate positions, waiting. She keyed her comm, "Sir, I'm counting at least 15 personnel in tactical positions. This doesn't match the intelligence profile." "Noted," Kessler replied. "Continue to your overwatch position." At JSOC, Vance reviewed the same thermal feeds, her concern manifesting in the phone call she placed to the intelligence section. "Pull up the previous operations in this sector," she ordered. "All of them from the last 4 months." The analyst brought up 3 previous missions, all targeting high-value personnel in similar circumstances. All had resulted in heavy contact and mission failure. The pattern was unmistakable once you looked for it. Intelligence that was too specific, timing that was too perfect, and situations that developed into prepared ambushes. Vance reached for the comm to abort the mission, but the team was already moving into the village perimeter, already committed to a situation that looked more like a trap with every passing second. She could only watch as Kessler led his people into what the intelligence asset had carefully prepared for them, wondering if Torres would be enough to make the difference when everything fell apart. Torres established her position on the ridgeline 800 meters from the village, exactly where Kessler had ordered despite her assessment that the location offered inadequate coverage. The rock outcropping provided decent concealment and a stable shooting platform, but the angle limited her view of the northern approach and completely blocked line of sight to the compound's rear entrance. She unpacked the M110 with practiced efficiency, each movement economical and deliberate. The rifle settled into position as she began her pre-engagement calculations. Wind was variable at 8 to 12 miles per hour from the southwest, temperature dropping as dawn approached, elevation difference requiring a 3.12 mil adjustment at this range. Every variable mattered when the difference between a hit and a miss could be measured in inches at distances where most people couldn't see the target. Through her scope, the village materialized in sharp detail. The target compound sprawled across the village center, 3 stone buildings arranged in a defensive configuration around a central courtyard. But what held Torres's attention were the fighters moving into positions on the rooftops and along the perimeter walls. She counted 4 on elevated positions, then 6, then 8 as more emerged from the buildings. At the village perimeter, Morrison moved point for the SEAL team, his weapon tracking across potential threats as they approached the compound. The streets lay empty in the pre-dawn darkness, no dogs barking, no sounds of normal village life. Just silence and the weight of eyes watching from shadows. Morrison keyed his comm visual on the target compound. Movement detected on rooftops. Count 3 personnel. Webb moved up beside him, glassing the compound through his thermal optics. "Make that 5 personnel. They're not acting like civilians." Torres watched the tactical situation develop, her count now at 12 fighters in deliberate defensive positions. She keyed her comm, keeping her voice level and professional. "I'm seeing at least 12 personnel in tactical positions around the compound. 4 on rooftops with overlapping fields of fire, 8 more at ground level. This looks like a prepared defense." Kessler's response came back clipped and dismissive. "Acknowledged. Maintain your position and let the operators work. We have the situation assessed." Webb glanced at Kessler, his expression hidden behind his night vision, but his body language conveying concern. "Commander, Captain Torres has better elevation and optics than we do. If she's seeing 12 fighters, we should reconsider the approach." Kessler studied the compound for another moment before responding. "The mission is to capture or kill the HVTs. We adapt to enemy presence. We don't abort because of it. Team will proceed with caution." Torres tracked more movement on the ridgelines surrounding the village, fighters positioning themselves in locations that created interlocking fields of fire. The tactical situation was deteriorating from concerning to critical, but Kessler had made clear he wasn't interested in her assessments. She logged the enemy positions in her memory, marking each location and estimating ranges. Northeast ridge at 900 meters, eastern slope at 840, southern rooftop at 790. The SEAL team breached the compound perimeter, moving with professional precision through the gate and into the courtyard. Morrison led with Chun and two others flanking, Webb holding center with Kessler directing from tactical command position. Their discipline was flawless, their experience evident in every movement and position. But discipline and experience meant nothing when you walked into a trap that someone had spent weeks preparing. Torres saw the pattern crystallizing, the way the enemy positions formed a three-sided kill zone with the compound at its center. The northeastern ridge, the eastern slope, the southern positions, all angled to create crossfire into the courtyard where the SEAL team was now moving. The rear approach she'd wanted to cover from a different position would be the enemy's primary assault route once they sprung the ambush. She keyed her comm again. "Commander, you're moving into a prepared kill zone. Enemy has positions on 3 ridges with coordinated fields of fire. Recommend immediate withdrawal." The response came back with barely controlled irritation. "Captain Torres, maintain calm discipline. We have the tactical situation in hand." Morrison reached the main building, stacking his team for entry. The door breached with practiced efficiency, the team flowing inside like water, finding its path. Torres maintained her overwatch, tracking the enemy positions that continued multiplying. 15 fighters now, maybe 18. The numbers kept growing as more emerged from concealment. At JSOC, Vance stared at the thermal feeds with growing horror. The pattern was identical to 3 previous operations she'd just reviewed. Intelligence pointing to high-value targets, teams moving into compounds that became kill zones, missions that should have been straightforward turning into desperate fights for survival. She pulled up the source data for the intelligence, tracing it back through the chain to a single asset who'd provided information for all 4 operations. The intelligence was compromised. Someone had been feeding enemy forces the mission details, letting them prepare ambushes tailored specifically to SEAL tactics and timing. And Kessler had just walked his team into the newest iteration of a trap that had already killed or wounded 11 operators over 3 previous missions. Vance grabbed the secure phone to Operations Command. "Abort mission immediate. Intelligence is compromised. Enemy has advanced knowledge and prepared positions." But the message would take minutes to route through command channels to the Tactical Operations Center to the birds to the team on the ground. Minutes they didn't have. In the village, Morrison's team cleared the first building and found it empty. No high-value targets, no enemy fighters, just abandoned rooms and the smell of recent cooking. The second building showed the same, empty spaces where intelligence had promised targets. Webb's voice came over the comm, controlled but urgent. "Buildings are clear but empty. This doesn't feel right." Torres watched a fighter on the northeastern ridge bring up a PCAM machine gun, settling it into position with the deliberate care of someone who knew exactly what target would soon appear in his sights. Another fighter on the eastern slope did the same, then a third on the southern rooftop. The ambush was seconds from initiation, and the SEAL team stood exposed in the courtyard with minimal cover and no idea what was about to hit them. She ranged the machine gun positions. Northeast at 912 meters, east at 847 meters, south at 793 meters. Her M110 could reach them all, but Kessler had ordered her to maintain overwatch only, not to engage without command authorization. The rules of engagement were clear, the command structure absolute. But Torres had learned in the San Jin Valley that sometimes the right decision meant breaking the wrong order. Sometimes survival required trusting your assessment over someone else's authority. The fighters were lining up their shots, the PKM gunners settling behind their weapons, and in approximately 15 seconds the courtyard would become a killing field. She made her decision, her finger moving to the trigger guard as she prepared to engage. The math was simple: 23 rounds in her magazine, at least 18 enemy fighters, and 7 teammates whose lives depended on whether she followed orders or trusted what the mountains were teaching her right now. The first PKM opened fire from the northeast ridge, then the second from the east, then the third from the south. The coordinated ambush erupted with the precision of a rehearsed operation, exactly as someone had planned it, exactly as intelligence had enabled it, and exactly as Torres had warned it would unfold. The PKM rounds tore through the courtyard in coordinated bursts, 3 machine guns firing from 3 directions with the precision of a rehearsed execution. Morrison dove behind a low stone wall as bullets chewed through the space where he'd been standing, concrete dust erupting in clouds that turned the pre-dawn air thick and choking. Ambush, he shouted into his comm. The word barely necessary given the volume of fire now pouring into the compound from elevated positions the team couldn't effectively engage. Kessler pressed against the building wall, his tactical computer already calculating angles and distances that added up to a nightmare scenario. They were caught in a courtyard with cover sufficient for maybe 4 men, 7 personnel total, and enemy fire coming from positions 800 to 900 meters away. The team's weapons were optimized for close and medium range, maybe effective out to 400 meters in skilled hands. The enemy had positioned themselves beyond that envelope, firing down into a kill zone with impunity. Chun took a round through his shoulder, the impact spinning him sideways before he collapsed behind the same wall Morrison occupied. Webb scrambled to reach him, dragging the wounded operator into the minimal cover as more rounds tracked their movement. Morrison keyed his comm while applying pressure to Chen's wound. "We need immediate extract. 3 wounded now, pinned down with inadequate cover. Enemy has superior position and range advantage." Torres had already engaged before Morrison finished speaking. Her first shot dropped a PKM gunner on the eastern ridge at 847 meters, the fighter's weapon going silent mid-burst. She cycled the bolt, acquired the second machine gun position, compensated for the crosswind that had increased by 2 miles per hour, and fired again. The northeastern gunner fell at 912 meters. The third PKM continued firing from the southern rooftop, but its rounds were less coordinated now, the gunner recognizing that something had changed in the tactical equation. Torres ranged him at 793 meters, noted his protected position behind a concrete wall, waited for him to expose himself during the next burst, and put a round through the gap when he leaned out to fire. In the courtyard, Webb noticed the change immediately. The devastating crossfire had been reduced to sporadic rifle shots from ground-level positions. Someone had eliminated the machine guns that would have shredded them in the next 60 seconds. Kessler pressed his calm, all stations, status report. Morrison responded while still working on Chun. Chun hit in the shoulder, stable, but needs medevac. Anders took grazing wound to the leg. Hamilton has shrapnel in his arm. We're pinned down and can't return effective fire at these ranges. Webb added his assessment. The machine guns have stopped. Someone took them out. Kessler glanced toward the ridgeline where Torres had established position, the reality of the situation finally penetrating through his assumptions about who could do what in combat. "Request immediate air support and medevac," he transmitted to Operations Command. The response came back with information that made the tactical situation even worse. "Medevac is 20 minutes out. Fast movers are 45 minutes away. You're on your own until then." Torres shifted her focus to the rifle positions on the eastern slope, where enemy fighters were attempting to maneuver closer to the compound. She engaged methodically, each shot preceded by rapid calculations of range, wind, temperature, and 1,000 variables that separated precision from chance. 890 meters, drop one fighter. 920 meters, drop another. 881 meters, a third. Morrison watched the eastern slope through his optics, seeing enemy fighters falling with mechanical regularity. Each drop corresponded with a sound he could barely hear over the ambient gunfire, the distinctive crack of a precision rifle operating at ranges his team's weapons couldn't match. "Captain Torres," he transmitted, his voice carrying none of the contempt from 12 hours earlier. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Torres didn't respond, her focus absolute as she worked through the enemy positions with the patience that Colorado mountains had taught her decades before anyone ever handed her a military rifle. Establish the target, calculate the variables, control the breathing, press the trigger, observe the hit, move to the next target. The rhythm was meditative, each shot a separate problem with a specific solution. Enemy fighters on the southern positions began breaking contact, recognizing they were being picked apart by someone they couldn't locate and couldn't effectively engage. Torres let them retreat, her training and rules of engagement both dictating that fleeing combatants didn't qualify as targets unless they continued to pose a threat. Kessler seized the moment of reduced fire to attempt repositioning his team toward better cover. "Move to the eastern wall," he ordered. "Webb, take point. Morrison, bring Chun." The team moved in controlled rushes, each man covering the others as they crossed the courtyard. Torres provided overwatch, her scope tracking potential threats, her finger ready on the trigger. A fighter appeared on the northern ridge, attempting to line up a shot on the moving SEALs. Torres engaged at 915 meters, and the threat disappeared. Webb reached the eastern wall and immediately recognized the improved tactical position. Better cover, better angles, and a clear path toward the compound's rear exit that might provide a withdrawal route. "Commander, this position is more defensible. We can hold here until extract arrives." At JSOC, Vance watched the thermal feeds showing the tactical situation transform from desperate to survivable. The enemy force that should have wiped out the SEAL team in the first minute of contact had been systematically dismantled by a single sniper operating at ranges that most people couldn't comprehend. She pulled up Torres's service record again, reviewing the statistics she'd already memorized. Qualified expert at distances out to 1,200 meters, combat-verified kills in excess of 50, performance scores that placed her in the top 0.1% of all military snipers. The statistics didn't capture what Vance was watching on the screens. The difference between a good sniper and an exceptional one, between someone who could make the shots on a range and someone who could make them under combat stress, while teammates died if she missed. Torres wasn't just good. She was operating at a level that maybe 30 people in the entire military could match. Morrison finished field dressing Chen's wound, the bleeding controlled and the wounded operator conscious and alert. He keyed his comm to the team channel. 7 minutes since contact initiated. Torres has dropped at least 15 enemy fighters and probably saved all our lives. His voice carried the weight of someone whose prejudice had just been burned away by reality. Kessler acknowledged with a simple copy, but the implications hung in the mountain air between transmitted words. His dismissiveness had nearly cost 7 lives. His prejudice had clouded tactical judgment. His assumptions about capability, based on anything other than demonstrated performance, had brought them to the edge of catastrophe. Torres maintained her position, scanning for remaining threats while her mind tracked ammunition expenditure. 18 rounds fired from a 20-round magazine, 2 remaining plus 1 in the chamber. If the enemy attempted another assault, she'd need to make every shot count. But the enemy fighters seemed to have reached the same conclusion Morrison had. Continuing this fight meant dying to someone they couldn't see and couldn't reach. The courtyard fell into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the distant sound of helicopter rotors growing louder as the medevac birds approached their location. Torres studied the tactical situation through her scope, analyzing what the enemy fighters would do next. The machine gun positions lay silent, their crews eliminated. Rifle positions on the eastern and southern slopes had been thinned by half. But at least a dozen fighters remained in covered positions, and they'd be regrouping, reassessing, preparing for another attempt once they understood what had changed. She keyed her calm, her voice carrying none of the satisfaction she might have felt at proving herself right. "Commander, enemy forces degraded but not eliminated. I count 12 to 15 fighters remaining in defensive positions. They'll attempt another assault once they coordinate." Kessler's response came after a pause that felt longer than the seconds it actually occupied. "Understood. What's your ammunition status?" "3 rounds remaining," Torres replied. "If they attack in force again, I'll need to make each one count." The reality of their situation crystallized in that transmission. The medevac birds were still 15 minutes out, maybe longer if they had to navigate around enemy fire. The SEAL team's weapons couldn't reach the enemy positions effectively, and Torres, who'd been carrying them through this fight, had 3 bullets left against an enemy force that numbered in the dozens. Webb pressed against the eastern wall, his mind working through the tactical problem. "We need to break contact before they regroup. If we move toward the northern perimeter, we can put buildings between us and their firing positions." Morrison checked Chen's bandages, the wounded operator's face pale but determined. "I can move," Chen said. "Just don't ask me to run a marathon." Kessler made his decision, recognizing that pride had no place in a situation where lives hung on tactical flexibility. "Captain Torres, we're going to attempt movement to the northern perimeter. I need you to cover our displacement and engage any threats that try to interdict." Torres had waited her entire career to hear a special operations commander ask for her support without qualification or dismissal in his voice. That it came in the middle of a firefight where she'd already saved his team didn't diminish the moment. "Roger that, Commander." Moving to better angle for northern coverage. She broke down her position with the same efficiency she'd established it, weapon and gear packed in 20 seconds, already moving along the ridgeline toward a rock formation that would provide line of sight to the team's withdrawal route. The new position offered less stability but better angles, and right now angles mattered more than comfort. The SEAL team moved in bounds, 2 men covering while 3 moved, then reversing the pattern. Webb led with Morrison supporting, Chun moving with assistance, Kessler directing from center position. They crossed the courtyard toward the northern gate, exposed for critical seconds during each movement phase. A fighter appeared on the southern ridge, recognizing the team's intent and attempting to interdict their withdrawal. Torres acquired him at 902 meters, compensated for her less stable shooting position, and fired. The fighter dropped, and the southern ridge went quiet again. 2 rounds remaining. The team reached the northern gate and passed through into the narrow streets beyond. Buildings now provided cover from the elevated positions, but also created close quarters ambush opportunities. Webb moved point with his weapon tracking potential threats at every corner and doorway. Torres shifted her position again, moving to maintain overwatch as the team displaced through the village. Her third position offered minimal cover but clear sight lines down 3 different streets. If enemy fighters attempted to flank the SEAL team through the urban terrain, she'd see them coming. At JSOC, Vance watched the team's movement markers progress toward the extraction landing zone. The tactical situation had stabilized, but she recognized how close it had come to complete disaster. 7 Special Operations personnel had walked into a trap that should have killed them all in the first 2 minutes of contact. Only Torres's exceptional shooting had prevented it. Vance pulled up the audio recordings from the mission, isolating Torres's warnings and Kessler's dismissive responses. The pattern was clear and damning. A qualified expert had provided accurate tactical intelligence that was ignored because of the expert's gender. The fact that everyone had survived didn't change the command failure that had nearly killed them. She made a note to herself. Request immediate after-action review, full investigation of command decisions, and formal inquiry into intelligence compromise. This incident would be Torres's vindication, but it would also be a reckoning for everyone whose prejudice had created unnecessary risk. In the village streets, Morrison spotted movement in a building ahead, fighters attempting to position themselves to ambush the team's route. "Contact front," he transmitted, bringing his weapon up. Torres saw them through a window opening, 3 fighters with rifles moving into position. She ranged the first at 890 meters, fired, and dropped him. 1 round remaining. The other 2 fighters retreated deeper into the building, recognizing they'd lost the element of surprise. The team adjusted their route, moving down a parallel street that Torres confirmed was clear. The extraction landing zone lay 300 meters ahead, an open area that would expose them during the final approach, but also allow the helicopters to land and recover them quickly. Webb reached the edge of the village, scanning the open ground between their position and the LZ. 200 meters of exposure with minimal cover and enemy fighters still active in the area. "Commander, this is going to be dicey. Once we're in the open, we're committed." Kessler acknowledged the assessment, then keyed his comm to Torres. "Captain, once we move into the open for extract, we'll be vulnerable for approximately 90 seconds. I need you to provide cover during that window." Torres studied the terrain, identifying the positions enemy fighters would use if they attempted to interdict the extraction. Eastern ridge, southern slope, building rooftops on the village perimeter. Multiple angles, multiple potential threats, and she had exactly 1 bullet left in her rifle. "Roger that, Commander," she replied. "I'll cover your extract." What she didn't say was that 1 round meant 1 target, and if more than 1 fighter attempted to engage during the team's withdrawal, she'd be reduced to being a spectator while teammates died. The math was simple and unforgiving, and there was nothing she could do about it except make that single remaining shot count more than any shot she'd ever fired. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder, 2 Blackhawks approaching from the south. The medevac birds would land, load the wounded and the team, and be airborne again in under 60 seconds if everything went perfectly. But perfect rarely happened in combat, and Torres knew the enemy fighters recognized this as their last opportunity to inflict casualties. Kessler transmitted the movement order. "All personnel, move to extract." The SEAL team broke from cover and ran across the open ground toward the landing zone. Webb led, Chin supported by 2 teammates in the middle, Morrison and Kessler providing rear security. They covered the distance in bounds, fast and professional, each man knowing that speed now mattered more than tactical perfection. Torres tracked the ridgelines and rooftops through her scope, her breathing controlled, her finger resting outside the trigger guard. 1 shot, 1 chance. The enemy would know this too, would recognize that the exposed team represented a final opportunity to salvage something from an ambush that had gone catastrophically wrong. Movement on the eastern ridge. A fighter rising with an RPG launcher, lining up on the approaching helicopters. Torres acquired him at 937 meters, calculated wind and elevation in the half-second she had available, and fired her final round. The fighter dropped, the RPG launcher falling unfired into the rocks. The Blackhawks flared over the landing zone, their rotors kicking up dust and debris as they descended. The SEAL team reached the birds with professional efficiency, medics immediately attending to Chun and the other wounded while the rest of the team established security around the aircraft. Torres maintained her overwatch position, her rifle now empty but still scanning for threats through the scope. The RPG fighter lay motionless on the eastern ridge, her final shot having prevented what would have been a catastrophic hit on one of the medevac birds. She watched the team load, counting personnel to ensure everyone made it aboard, her position still exposed on the ridgeline above the village. Webb keyed his comm, "Captain Torres, you're clear to move to extract. Birds are secure." Torres broke down her position for the final time, moving down the mountain slope toward the landing zone with her empty weapon and the knowledge that if enemy fighters engage her now, she had nothing left to shoot back with. But the village had gone quiet, the remaining fighters apparently deciding that discretion beat dying to prove a point. She reached the LZ as the last team members were boarding. Kessler stood by the second Blackhawk, waiting, his expression unreadable behind his combat gear. Torres moved toward the aircraft, expecting to board without ceremony, but Kessler stepped forward and extended his hand. "That was outstanding work, Captain," he said, his voice carrying through the rotor wash. "You saved this team." Torres accepted the handshake, recognizing the cost it took for a SEAL commander to admit he'd been wrong. "Just doing my job, sir." Morrison appeared at the helicopter door, his weapon slung and his earlier hostility completely absent. "Captain, I need to say this. You saved my life today. Probably saved all our lives. I was wrong about you, and I'm sorry." Torres nodded once, acknowledging the apology without elaborating. The firefight had burned away prejudice more effectively than any argument could have, and there was nothing to be gained by dwelling on what people had thought before reality taught them differently. The flight back to the FOB took 20 minutes, the helicopters staying low through the mountain passes. Chen received continued medical attention from the flight medics. His shoulder wound serious but not life-threatening. The other wounded operators were stable, their injuries the kind that would heal with time and leave scars that told stories. Webb sat near Torres during the flight, his eyes on the mountains passing beneath them. 20 years I've been doing this," he said. "That was the best shooting I've ever seen under combat conditions. Not the best woman shooter or the best Marine shooter. The best shooter, period." Torres didn't respond immediately, her mind still processing the engagement, counting shots, and calculating what might have happened if any single variable had been different. Eventually she said, "Range time is range time, Chief. Gender doesn't change ballistics." Webb smiled at that, recognizing the philosophy that separated truly professional operators from people who let irrelevant factors cloud their judgment. He nodded and settled back for the remainder of the flight, comfortable in the silence that came from shared experience. At the FOB, the helicopters landed and the wounded were transferred to the medical facility for treatment. The rest of the team moved through standard post-mission procedures: weapons cleaning, gear accountability, preliminary debriefings. Torres found a quiet corner to field strip and clean her M110, the ritual familiar and centering after the chaos of combat. Kessler appeared an hour later, now out of his combat gear and looking substantially more tired than he had during the mission brief 24 hours earlier. "Captain Torres, I need to begin the after-action report. I'd like your input on the tactical situation and the intelligence failures we encountered." Torres looked up from her rifle cleaning. "Sir, you'll need to document how many times I reported enemy positions and how those reports were received. That's going to be part of the investigation." Kessler absorbed that reality with the expression of someone who'd already recognized where the after-action review would lead. "I know, and you're right to make sure it's documented. My dismissiveness nearly got people killed. That's on me, and I won't minimize it in the report." He sat down across from her, pulling out a tactical notebook. "Walk me through your observations from insertion to extract. Everything you saw, everything you reported, and every engagement." Torres provided a detailed account, including specific ranges, wind conditions, target acquisitions, and the systematic elimination of enemy positions. 23 rounds fired, 21 confirmed hits, ranges from 793 meters to 937 meters. Engagement duration approximately 11 minutes from first shot to last. Kessler wrote steadily, documenting information that would form the backbone of an investigation into command decisions and intelligence failures. When Torres finished, he looked up and said, "For what it's worth, you conducted yourself with more professionalism than I did throughout this entire operation. From the briefing onward, you were right and I was wrong. That won't happen again." At JSOC, Colonel Vance had already begun the formal investigation process. She reviewed mission recordings, communications logs, and the intelligence that had led the SEAL team into a prepared ambush. The pattern was clear: for operations, for intelligence reports from the same source, for ambushes that cost lives and mission success. She pulled up Torres's communications, listening to each report of enemy positions and each dismissive response from Kessler. The contrast was stark. A qualified expert providing accurate tactical intelligence that was ignored not because it was wrong, but because the expert didn't fit someone's preconceptions about who could provide valuable combat information. Vance drafted her initial report, knowing it would trigger reviews at multiple command levels. One female Marine sniper had not only saved 7 special operations personnel, but had also exposed systemic failures in how expertise was evaluated and integrated. The investigation would examine Kessler's command decisions, but it would also force broader questions about gender integration and how prejudice created tactical vulnerabilities. She picked up the phone and called Admiral James Hartley at JSOC headquarters. "Sir, we have a situation that requires flag officer attention. A SEAL team walked into a compromised operation today and only survived because of a Marine attachment that the team commander had specifically requested not to have." Hartley listened to the summary, his questions precise and cutting. "How many times did the Marine report enemy positions that were subsequently confirmed accurate?" "Multiple times, sir." "All ignored or dismissed." Her final engagement statistics show 21 confirmed hits at ranges between 800 and 940 meters under combat stress. Hartley was quiet for a moment. "Give me the full after-action package, all communications recordings, and Torres's complete service record. This is going to require comprehensive review, and I want everything documented before anyone tries to minimize what happened." Back at the FOB, Torres finished cleaning her weapon and began the mental process of transitioning from combat to whatever came next. She knew the after-action review would be extensive, knew her performance would be analyzed and discussed at command levels she'd never directly interact with. But more importantly, she knew that 7 people were alive who might not have been, and that was the only metric that ultimately mattered. Morrison found her later that evening in the dining facility. He sat down across from her, without asking permission, his expression serious. "I need you to know something," he said. "My behavior before the mission was inexcusable. I let prejudice override judgment, and that's a failure of character. You don't owe me forgiveness, but I want you to know I recognize what I did wrong." Torres studied him for a moment, seeing genuine remorse rather than performance. "We all carry assumptions until reality corrects them," she said. "What matters is what you do after reality teaches the lesson." Morrison nodded and stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, if I ever deploy again and need a sniper cover in my position, I'd specifically request you. That's not charity or making amends. That's just recognizing the best when I see it." He walked away, leaving Torres alone with her thoughts and the knowledge that sometimes change came through bullets and blood, but it came nonetheless. 3 days after the operation, Colonel Vance sat in her JSOC office reviewing communications recordings for the 4th time. Each replay confirmed what she'd known from the first listening. Kessler had received accurate tactical intelligence from Torres and dismissed it repeatedly, creating unnecessary risk that nearly resulted in catastrophic casualties. She pulled up the parallel investigation into the intelligence compromise, reading reports that confirmed her suspicions. The source who'd provided information for all 4 operations had been feeding enemy forces detailed mission parameters, allowing them to prepare ambushes tailored specifically to counter special operations tactics. 3 previous teams had walked into similar traps with less fortunate outcomes. 2 operators killed, 9 wounded, for missions failed. Torres had broken that pattern through exceptional skill and the kind of tactical judgment that came from experience rather than prejudice. But the bigger question remained: how many other operations have been compromised by commanders who dismissed valid expertise because it came from sources they didn't expect? Vance picked up the phone and called Webb, who'd returned to the FOB for standard post-deployment processing. "Chief, I need your perspective on something. You've been in special operations for 2 decades. How common is the dynamic we saw on this mission?" Webb's response came after careful consideration. "Ma'am, I've seen it enough times that I recognize the pattern. Someone brings expertise that doesn't fit expectations, and instead of evaluating the expertise on merit, commanders evaluate it based on who's providing it. It's not always about gender. Sometimes it's rank, age, branch of service, or just unfamiliarity with someone's background. But it creates the same result regardless of the reason," Vance said. "Yes, ma'am. Creates blind spots that enemies can exploit. We got lucky this time because Captain Torres was skilled enough to save the mission despite being marginalized. But luck isn't a strategy." Vance made notes as Webb spoke, recognizing she was documenting a systemic issue that extended far beyond one mission or one team. What would you recommend to prevent this pattern in future operations? Webb's answer was immediate. Mandatory integration of diverse specialties during training evolutions. If you train together and see each other perform under stress before you deploy, prejudice gets corrected early. By the time you're in combat, you know who can deliver and who can't, regardless of what assumptions you started with. Vance added that recommendation to her growing list. She'd interview Morrison next, then Torres herself, building a comprehensive picture of command failures and the cultural factors that enabled them. At the FOB, Torres received orders to report to JSOC headquarters for formal debriefing. The summons wasn't unexpected, but the timing suggested urgency beyond standard after-action procedures. She packed her gear and caught a transport flight the following morning, trading the dust and heat of Afghanistan for the air-conditioned corridors of command headquarters. The interview took place in a secure conference room with Vance, a senior investigating officer, and a JAG attorney present. Torres provided the same detailed account she'd given Kessler, walking through each observation, each warning, and each engagement with clinical precision. The investigating officer asked pointed questions. Captain Torres, did you at any point feel that your tactical assessments were dismissed because of your gender? Torres considered the question carefully. Sir, I can't speak to Commander Kessler's internal reasoning. What I can document is that I provided accurate tactical intelligence that was dismissed or minimized, and that dismissal created unnecessary risk. Whether the dismissal was based on gender, branch of service, or other factors is beyond my ability to determine with certainty. But you had reason to believe gender was a factor, the officer pressed. Torres met his eyes directly. Sir, Commander Kessler specifically requested that no female personnel be attached to his team. That request is documented. His subsequent dismissal of my assessments occurred within that context. I'll let others draw conclusions about causation. Vance watched Torres navigate the interview with the same professionalism she demonstrated throughout the operation. The captain wasn't seeking to maximize Kessler's culpability or to position herself as a victim. She was simply stating facts and allowing those facts to speak for themselves. The interview concluded after 2 hours. The investigating officer thanked Torres for her cooperation and informed her she should expect the investigation to continue for several weeks. She was dismissed to temporary quarters pending further orders. That evening, Vance found Torres in the headquarters gym, working through a training routine with the focus of someone who processed stress through physical activity. The colonel waited until Torres finished her set before approaching. Captain, can we talk informally? Torres grabbed a towel and nodded. Of course, ma'am. They moved to a quiet corner away from other personnel. I want you to understand what's happening with this investigation, Vance said. This goes beyond one mission or one commander. We're examining patterns across multiple operations and identifying systemic issues in how expertise is evaluated and integrated. Torres absorbed that information. Ma'am, if I may ask, was my selection for this mission deliberate? Vance didn't hesitate. Yes, I knew Kessler had requested no female attachments. I also knew you were the most qualified sniper available for that terrain and mission profile. I hoped that putting you in a position to demonstrate capability would force a confrontation with prejudice that needed to happen. So I was used to make a point, Torres said without hostility. You were selected because you were the best available operator for the mission, Vance corrected. That you also happened to force an examination of systemic prejudice was a secondary benefit. But I won't pretend I didn't consider both factors when I made the assignment. Torres processed that revelation, understanding the chess game that occurred at command levels above her immediate awareness. Ma'am, I'm not comfortable being used as a test case, even if the goal is cultural change. I understand that, and I apologize for placing you in that position without informed consent. But I need you to consider something. How many female service members will get opportunities they deserve because this investigation forces systemic changes? How many lives might be saved in future operations because commanders learn to evaluate expertise on merit rather than expectations? Torres recognized the utilitarian argument, even as it conflicted with her desire to simply do her job without being a symbol of anything larger. She thought about the young female Marines coming through sniper school, the ones who'd faced the same prejudices she'd encountered, and whether her experience might make their path slightly less difficult. I understand the argument, ma'am. I just wish cultural change didn't require combat as the teaching mechanism. Vance nodded. So do I, Captain. So do I. 2 days later, Morrison submitted a voluntary statement to the investigating officer. The statement detailed his hostile behavior toward Torres before the mission, acknowledging specific incidents, including the deliberate bumping of her rifle case and his exclusionary tactics during tactical movement. He requested formal reprimand and remedial training, taking full accountability without attempting to minimize his actions. The investigating officer reviewed the statement with surprise. In his experience, service members typically minimize their culpability during investigations. Morrison's voluntary acceptance of responsibility was unusual and suggested genuine understanding of his failures rather than performance for favorable treatment. Kessler's after-action report was equally direct in documenting his command failures. He detailed each instance where Torres provided accurate intelligence that he dismissed, the tactical consequences of those dismissals, and his assessment that prejudice had impaired his judgment. The report concluded with a recommendation that he be removed from command pending leadership evaluation and remedial training. Admiral Hartley reviewed both documents along with Vance's preliminary investigation findings. The picture was clear. Systemic failures in how special operations evaluated and integrated diverse expertise, enabled by cultural assumptions that created tactical vulnerabilities. One exceptional operator had prevented disaster this time, but the underlying problems persisted across the special operations community. He called Vance to his office. "Colonel, I'm elevating this investigation to comprehensive review of gender integration protocols across all special operations units. I want you to lead it. You'll have access to any resources and personnel you need. We're going to fix this before more people die because commanders can't see past their prejudices." Vance accepted the assignment, knowing it would consume months of work and face resistance from multiple quarters. But Torres's performance had provided undeniable evidence that capability existed independent of gender, and that prejudice created exploitable weaknesses. The investigation now had momentum and flag officer support. Real change might actually be possible. Back at the FOB, Torres received notification of her next assignment. Temporary duty at Marine Corps Scout Sniper School as a guest instructor, teaching advanced mountain tactics to the next generation of precision shooters. The assignment carried the implicit message that her expertise was valued and would be shared rather than wasted. She packed her gear for the trip back to the States, her M110 secured in its case, the weapon that had fired 23 rounds to save 7 lives now cleaned and ready for whatever came next. The mountains in Afghanistan had taught their lessons. Now different mountains would hear those lessons passed forward to people who'd faced their own moments when precision mattered more than prejudice. 6 weeks after the operation, Vance sat in a Pentagon briefing room with reports spread across the conference table. Her investigation had expanded beyond the single mission to examine integration protocols across the entire special operations community. The findings painted a troubling picture of systemic failures enabled by cultural resistance to change. She'd identified 17 separate incidents over 3 years where qualified female personnel had their expertise dismissed or minimized during operations. 3 had resulted in mission failures that might have been prevented. 2 had resulted in casualties. The pattern was undeniable once you looked for it. Expertise evaluation based on expectation rather than demonstrated capability, creating tactical blind spots that enemies could exploit. Admiral Hartley entered the briefing room with 3 other flag officers, each representing different special operations commands. They took seats around the table as Vance organized her presentation materials. "Colonel, walk us through what you found," Hartley said. Vance began with Torres's mission, using it as the clearest example of the broader pattern. A Marine sniper with exceptional qualifications was attached to a SEAL team despite the commander's explicit request for no female personnel. During mission execution, she provided accurate tactical intelligence that was dismissed multiple times. The team walked into a prepared ambush that should have resulted in total casualties. Only the sniper's exceptional performance prevented disaster. She displayed Torres's engagement statistics on the screen. 23 rounds fired, 21 confirmed hits, ranges between 793 and 937 meters, all under combat stress while teammates were wounded and pinned down. One of the flag officers leaned forward. Those are extraordinary numbers, even for optimal conditions. Under combat stress, that's exceptional by any standard. Vance nodded. Captain Torres ranks in the top 0.1% of all military snipers based on performance metrics. She had 2 previous combat deployments with verified kills in similar terrain. Her qualifications were unquestionable, yet her tactical assessments were dismissed repeatedly, creating unnecessary risk. She moved to the next section of her presentation, showing communications recordings where Torres reported enemy positions and Kessler's dismissive responses. The contrast was stark. Clear professional reporting met with responses that range from curt acknowledgement to outright disregard. Now multiply this pattern across 17 documented incidents, Vance said. Female intelligence analysts whose warnings were ignored before attacks. Female pilots whose tactical recommendations were dismissed. Female combat controllers whose target assessments were second-guessed. In each case, qualified personnel providing accurate information that was evaluated based on source rather than content. Hartley asked the critical question, what's the common factor beyond gender? Is this purely prejudice, or are there other elements? Vance had anticipated the question. Sir, the common factor is unfamiliarity. Commanders who trained and deployed with female personnel in previous assignments showed significantly less dismissive behavior. The problem occurs most frequently when commanders encounter female expertise for the first time in operational settings, especially in roles traditionally held exclusively by men. So training and exposure reduce the problem, another flag officer observed. Significantly, Vance confirmed, which leads to my recommendations. She displayed her proposed protocol, changes on the screen. Mandatory integrated training evolutions for all special operations units, bringing together diverse specialties before deployment. Performance-based evaluation standards that removed subjective assessment of expertise. Command-level accountability for dismissing qualified input regardless of source. And comprehensive after-action reviews examining not just what happened, but whose assessments were accurate and whose were integrated into tactical decisions. The briefing room was quiet as the flag officers absorbed the implications. These weren't minor procedural adjustments. These were fundamental changes to how special operations evaluated and integrated expertise, requiring cultural shifts that would face resistance from multiple directions. Hartley broke the silence. Colonel, I'm authorizing implementation of these protocols across JSOC. You'll coordinate with each command to develop specific integration plans. I want the first training evolutions running within 90 days. Vance acknowledged the order, recognizing the magnitude of what she'd just been tasked with accomplishing. Changing training protocols was one thing. Changing the cultural assumptions that created dismissive behavior was something else entirely. At Quantico, Torres stood before a classroom of Marine Scout sniper students, 23 men and 2 women, all watching her with the intensity of people who understood that what they learned here might save their lives downrange. She'd been teaching mountain tactics for 3 weeks, sharing lessons from 2 deployments and 1 very long morning in an Afghan valley. Today's focus was on decision-making under pressure, specifically how to evaluate tactical situations when you have information that command elements don't share. Torres displayed a topographical map on the screen, identical to the one from her mission. You're in Overwatch position here, she said, marking the ridgeline. Your team is preparing to breach this compound. You've identified 12 to 15 enemy fighters in defensive positions. You report this to your team commander, who acknowledges but proceeds with the assault plan unchanged. What do you do? The students considered the scenario, recognizing it wasn't purely hypothetical. One of the male students spoke first. Ma'am, at that point you've done your job by reporting. The command decision is above your level. Torres nodded. That's one perspective. Anyone see it differently? One of the female students raised her hand. Ma'am, if you have information that significantly changes the tactical picture, you have an obligation to ensure that information is understood and integrated. Not just reported, but understood. Torres recognized the distinction the student was making. Elaborate on that. Reporting is one-way communication, the student said. Understanding is two-way. If command dismisses your assessment, you need to ensure they're dismissing it based on different information, not based on assumptions about your capability to assess the situation. Torres let that sink in for the other students. What she's describing is the difference between following procedure and exercising tactical judgment. Both matter, but sometimes tactical judgment requires pushing back against dismissive responses until you're certain your assessment has been heard and evaluated on its merits. She shared her experience from the Afghanistan mission, not emphasizing her own performance, but focusing on the decision points where she'd had to choose between following orders and trusting her assessment of the tactical situation. The students listened with complete attention, understanding they were receiving lessons that textbooks didn't capture. After class, the two female students approached Torres privately. One of them asked the question that had been on both their minds. Ma'am, how do you handle situations where you know your assessments are being dismissed because of your gender? Torres considered her response carefully. You document everything. You report clearly and professionally. You maintain your standards regardless of how others respond. And when the situation requires it, you trust your assessment over someone else's dismissal. But you do it knowing there will be consequences, and you accept those consequences as the cost of doing what's right. The students absorbed that reality, recognizing Torres was describing a path that required both exceptional skill and exceptional resilience. It wasn't a comfortable answer, but it was an honest one. At JSOC, Morrison received orders to report to the new integration training program as both a student and a case study. The orders were explicit. He would undergo comprehensive training on bias recognition and mitigation, then serve as an instructor helping other special operations personnel understand how prejudice created tactical vulnerabilities. Morrison accepted the assignment without complaint, recognizing it as both consequence and opportunity. His behavior before the Afghanistan mission had nearly contributed to catastrophic casualties. Now he had the chance to ensure other operators didn't make the same mistakes, didn't let assumptions override assessment of actual capability. He reported to the training facility where Vance had established the pilot program. The first evolution brought together SEAL, Marine, Army, and Air Force Special Operations personnel with diverse specialties and backgrounds. The scenario was simple. Plan and execute a compound raid with intelligence provided by team members whose expertise you might not expect. Morrison found himself working with a female Air Force combat controller whose experience included more combat deployments than half the SEALs in the room, and an Army intelligence analyst whose assessment of enemy patterns proved more accurate than the scenario planners had anticipated. The evolution forced him to evaluate expertise based on demonstrated capability rather than preconceptions, and to recognize how many times he'd made faulty assumptions based on irrelevant factors. The training was uncomfortable, forcing examination of biases he'd previously rationalized or dismissed. But discomfort was the point. Cultural change required more than policy adjustments. It required individual operators confronting their own prejudices and actively choosing to evaluate expertise differently. Kessler underwent similar training at a different facility, his participation part of the leadership evaluation Admiral Hartley had ordered. The program was more intensive for commanders, focusing on how leadership decisions either reinforced or challenged cultural biases within teams. Kessler worked through scenarios where he had to identify and correct dismissive behavior, both his own and others. The experience was humbling, forcing recognition of how many times over his career he'd made similar mistakes with less obvious consequences. The Afghanistan mission had been the clearest example, but there had been others. Intelligence assessments he'd minimized, tactical recommendations he'd discounted, expertise he'd failed to integrate because it came from sources he didn't expect. 3 months after the investigation began, Vance briefed Admiral Hartley on initial results from the integration training program. The data showed measurable improvement in how teams evaluated and integrated diverse expertise. Post-training assessments demonstrated reduced, dismissive behavior and increased utilization of qualified personnel regardless of background. But the real test would come during actual operations, when stress and time pressure created conditions where people reverted to ingrained patterns. Training could establish new frameworks. Combat would reveal whether those frameworks held under pressure or collapsed when tested by reality. For months after the Afghanistan operation, formal consequences arrived through official channels. Kessler received orders to report to Admiral Hartley's office at JSOC headquarters, the summons carrying the weight of career-defining judgment. Hartley's office overlooked the operations floor where analysts monitored active missions across multiple theaters. The Admiral sat behind his desk reviewing Kessler's complete file: 10 years of exemplary service, multiple successful operations, and one catastrophic failure of judgment that had nearly killed 7 people. "Commander Kessler, sit down," Hartley said without preamble. "You've completed the leadership evaluation program. I've reviewed the instructor's assessments, your after-action report, and Colonel Vance's investigation findings. Tell me what you've learned." Kessler had spent 4 months preparing for this moment, examining his failures with the kind of honesty that military culture often discouraged. "Sir, I learned that my prejudice created tactical vulnerabilities that enemy forces could exploit. I dismissed accurate intelligence from a qualified expert because that expert didn't fit my expectations about who could provide valuable combat information. That failure nearly resulted in total casualties." Hartley leaned forward. "Nearly resulted, but didn't because Captain Torres was skilled enough to save your team despite being marginalized. That's not leadership, Commander. That's luck disguised as survival." "Yes, sir," Kessler replied. "I understand that distinction now." The Admiral opened a folder containing the official determination. "You're receiving a formal letter of reprimand that will remain in your permanent record. You're removed from team command effective immediately. You'll be reassigned to the training directorate where you'll help develop and implement the new integration protocols. Your performance in that assignment will determine whether your career continues or concludes." Kessler absorbed the judgment, recognizing it was both fair and merciful given the magnitude of his failures. He could have faced court-martial for reckless endangerment. Instead, he was being given an opportunity to correct systemic problems he'd exemplified. "Thank you, sir. I won't waste this chance." Hartley's expression remained stern. "You'll be working directly with Colonel Vance. She'll evaluate your contribution to the integration program. If you demonstrate genuine change rather than performance for career preservation, we'll discuss your future. If not, you'll be retired within 18 months. Clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." Morrison and 2 other team members received different consequences. They were reassigned to separate units with mandatory completion of the integration training program. Morrison's voluntary accountability statement had been noted favorably, but accountability meant accepting consequences rather than avoiding them. He reported to his new assignment at Naval Special Warfare Development Group, where the commanding officer made expectations explicit during their initial meeting. "You're here because you demonstrated prejudice that compromise team effectiveness. Your technical skills are valued, but your judgment needs correction. You'll complete the integration program and you'll demonstrate change behavior. Otherwise, you're done in special operations." Morrison accepted the terms, recognizing that his apology to Torres had been step 1. Step 2 through 100 would be proving through consistent behavior that he'd learned the lesson permanently rather than temporarily. At Marine Corps Base Quantico, Torres received notification of her formal recognition. The Bronze Star with Valor would be presented in a ceremony attended by senior Marine Corps and JSOC leadership, her actions in Afghanistan deemed worthy of significant public acknowledgement. But the more meaningful recognition came through different channels. Her after-action report was designated required reading at Scout Sniper School, Special Operations Command courses, and leadership development programs across all branches. The tactical decisions she'd made under combat stress would teach thousands of future operators about precision shooting, tactical judgment, and the cost of dismissing qualified expertise. Admiral Hartley personally presented the Bronze Star at a ceremony in Quantico's main auditorium. His remarks were pointed and deliberate, crafted not just to honor Torres, but to send a message throughout the special operations community. Captain Torres demonstrated exceptional skill under combat conditions, saving 7 lives through precision shooting at extreme ranges while teammates were wounded and pinned down. But this ceremony recognizes more than marksmanship. It recognizes the professionalism required to provide accurate tactical intelligence that was repeatedly dismissed and the judgment required to act on that intelligence when survival demanded it. Captain Torres embodies the standard we expect from all special operations personnel, expertise evaluated by performance rather than preconception. The message was clear to everyone in attendance. This wasn't just about one exceptional operator. This was about systemic change, using Torres's performance as the undeniable evidence that change was necessary. After the ceremony, Torres found herself surrounded by Marines and special operations personnel asking detailed questions about her engagement calculations, decision-making process, and how she'd maintained focus while teammates were being wounded. She answered each question with the same clinical precision she'd demonstrated during the investigation, treating the attention as an educational opportunity rather than personal celebration. Webb appeared through the crowd, now wearing senior chief insignia. His promotion had come through with explicit orders. Report to the integration training program as senior enlisted advisor, helping develop training protocols that would prevent future teams from making the mistakes his team had made. "Congratulations on the promotion, Chief," Torres said. Webb smiled. "Congratulations on the recognition. You earned about 6 times over." He paused, then added more seriously, "I've been assigned to help build the new training program. Your after-action analysis is the foundation we're building from. Every evolution will start with a question. Are we evaluating expertise based on demonstrated capability or based on expectations?" Torres appreciated that her experience was being translated into practical training rather than abstract policy. "That's the right question. The challenge is getting people to answer it honestly under stress. That's where the training comes in," Webb replied. "We're creating scenarios where teams succeed or fail based on whether they integrate diverse expertise. Make the lesson concrete enough, and it sticks better than any briefing." Across multiple commands, the integration protocols began full implementation. SEAL teams conducted joint training with Marine reconnaissance units that included female operators. Army Special Forces worked integrated exercises with Air Force combat controllers and intelligence analysts. The scenarios were designed to force evaluation of expertise under pressure, creating situations where teams either learned to integrate diverse capabilities or faced simulated mission failure. The initial resistance was substantial. Decades of cultural assumptions didn't disappear because policies changed. But the training was mandatory, commanded by flag officers who'd made clear this wasn't negotiable. Teams that resisted found themselves facing additional training cycles. Teams that adapted found their operational effectiveness actually improved as they learned to evaluate and integrate capabilities they'd previously overlooked. Colonel Vance monitored the implementation across all special operations commands, tracking metrics that would determine whether the changes were superficial or substantive. She measured not just training completion rates, but behavioral indicators. How often were qualified assessments dismissed during exercises whose expertise was integrated into tactical decisions, and whether teams showed improved performance after integration training. 6 months into implementation, the data showed measurable progress. Teams that completed the integrated training demonstrated 23% fewer instances of dismissed expertise during exercises and performed better on complex scenarios requiring coordination across diverse specialties. The cultural change was beginning to translate into operational improvement. But Vance recognized that 6 months of training didn't erase decades of cultural conditioning. The real test would come during actual combat operations, when stress and time pressure revealed whether the training held or collapsed under real-world conditions. Torres received new orders, promotion to major and assignment to Marine Corps Special Operations Command as a liaison officer. The position would place her at the intersection of policy development and operational planning, giving her direct influence over how integration protocols were implemented at the operational level. She accepted the promotion with the same professional composure she demonstrated throughout her career, recognizing that visibility came with responsibility. She'd become more than an individual operator. She'd become a symbol of what was possible when expertise was evaluated fairly, and a reminder of what was at stake when it wasn't. At the training directorate, Kessler worked 16-hour days developing scenario-based training that forced commanders to confront their own biases. His personal failure had given him insight into the thought patterns that enabled dismissive behavior, and he used that insight to design training that was uncomfortable by design. Cultural change required discomfort, required people examining assumptions they'd held for decades. He worked directly with Vance, who evaluated his contribution with the same analytical precision she'd applied to the investigation. The question wasn't whether Kessler felt remorseful. The question was whether he could translate that remorse into substantive contribution to preventing future failures. Morrison completed his integration training and returned to operational status with his new unit, his technical skills unchanged, but his approach to evaluating teammates fundamentally different. He deployed 3 months later on a mission that included a female intelligence analyst whose assessment of enemy patterns proved critical to mission success. Morrison integrated her analysis immediately and without question, the lesson from Afghanistan permanently altering how he evaluated expertise. The cultural change was happening slowly and unevenly, but happening nonetheless. One mission, one investigation, and one exceptional operator's performance had created momentum for systemic transformation. The special operations community was learning what Torres had always known. Excellence was excellence regardless of who demonstrated it, and survival required recognizing that truth before reality taught it through casualties. 1 year after the Afghanistan operation, the integration protocols had been implemented across every special operations command. The changes were comprehensive: mandatory mixed-gender training evolutions, performance-based evaluation standards that eliminated subjective assessment, and command-level accountability for dismissing qualified input regardless of source. At Camp Lejeune, Torres observed a Marine Special Operations Regiment training evolution that would have been impossible 12 months earlier. The exercise brought together operators from 3 different specialties, including 4 female Marines selected purely on performance metrics rather than gender quotas or diversity initiatives. The scenario required coordinated action across intelligence analysis, direct action, and precision fires, with success depending on whether the team integrated all available expertise. The evolution commander, a Marine lieutenant colonel, reviewed intelligence provided by a female analyst who'd identified enemy patterns the initial brief had missed. Rather than dismissing or minimizing her assessment, he adjusted the tactical plan immediately, incorporating her analysis into the operational approach. The team executed with precision, succeeding because expertise was evaluated on merit rather than source. Torres watched from the observation post with satisfaction that wasn't personal but systemic. This was what change looked like when it moved beyond policy into practice, when commanders learned through repetition and consequence that integration improved rather than degraded operational capability. Major Torres, a voice called from behind her. She turned to find Admiral Hartley approaching, his presence at a regiment level, training evolution unusual and therefore significant. "Admiral," she acknowledged. Hartley joined her at the observation post. Watching the evolution conclude below. I wanted to see the results firsthand. What's your assessment? Torres considered her response carefully. Sir, the technical execution is solid. The real progress is in how naturally the team integrated diverse expertise. 12 months ago, that female analyst's assessment would have been noted and possibly dismissed. Today, it was incorporated immediately because the commander has been trained to evaluate content rather than source. Hartley nodded. That's what we're after. Not forcing integration for its own sake, but creating conditions where capability is recognized and utilized regardless of packaging. He paused, then added, Your after-action report has been read by every special operations commander in the military. Your performance set a standard that's now being taught at every level. That's impact beyond any single mission. Torres appreciated the recognition, but remained focused on the broader goal. Sir, one exceptional performance shouldn't be required to prove that women can operate at this level. The standard should be the standard, applied equally. Agreed, Hartley said, which is why we're making these changes permanent rather than experimental. The protocols we've implemented based on your mission and Colonel Vance's investigation are now doctrine, not pilot programs. At the JSOC training facility, Webb led a class of senior enlisted personnel through scenario-based training designed to identify and correct dismissive behavior. The scenarios were sophisticated, creating situations where expertise came from unexpected sources and teams succeeded or failed based on whether they integrated that expertise. One scenario placed a female Air Force officer with extensive Middle Eastern cultural expertise in an advisory role to a SEAL team planning a raid. Her assessment identified critical cultural factors the team's initial plan had overlooked, factors that would determine whether the raid succeeded or triggered a broader tribal conflict. Webb watched as the team commander initially dismissed her input, focusing on kinetic aspects of the operation while minimizing cultural considerations. The scenario played forward, and the simulated raid succeeded tactically but triggered the exact tribal conflict she'd warned about, creating strategic failure from tactical success. Webb paused the scenario. Senior Chief Mendez, walk me through your decision process when the cultural advisor provided her assessment. The SEAL Senior Chief looked uncomfortable. I acknowledged her input, but prioritized the direct action plan. The cultural factors seemed secondary to mission execution. Webb let that answer hang in the air before responding. So you prioritize your specialty over hers, even though her specialty was directly relevant to mission success at the strategic level. That's the pattern we're here to break. Expertise is expertise. Your job as a senior leader is to recognize when someone knows more than you do about a critical factor and integrate that knowledge rather than dismiss it because it comes from outside your comfort zone. The lesson was direct and uncomfortable, which made it effective. Cultural change required more than policy adjustments. It required individual leaders confronting their own biases and actively choosing to evaluate expertise differently. Morrison sat in the same class, now serving as both student and occasional instructor. His personal experience gave him credibility when discussing how prejudice created tactical vulnerabilities. He shared the Afghanistan story from his perspective, describing his hostile behavior toward Torres and how that behavior had nearly contributed to getting his team killed. The story was humbling to tell, but necessary. Other operators needed to hear directly from someone who'd made the mistakes, faced the consequences, and learned permanently from the experience. Morrison's transformation wasn't complete, probably never would be, but it was genuine and ongoing. At the Pentagon, Vance briefed congressional oversight committees on the integration program's first-year results. The statistics were compelling. 23% improvement in mission success rates for teams that completed the integrated training, 31% reduction in preventable tactical errors, and measurable increases in operational effectiveness across multiple commands. But the most significant finding was qualitative rather than quantitative. Teams that trained together in diverse configurations developed broader tactical perspectives, identified threats earlier, and adapted more effectively to complex situations. Integration wasn't degrading operational capability. It was enhancing it. A senator asked the question Vance had been anticipating. Colonel, how do we know these improvements come from gender integration rather than just improved training generally? Vance displayed comparison data. Sir, we track control groups that received equivalent training hours without the integrated component. Those teams showed improvement, but significantly less than the integrated teams. The difference is attributable to exposure to diverse perspectives and the requirement to evaluate expertise on merit rather than expectation. When you expand the pool of expertise you're willing to consider, you make better decisions. The Congressional Committee approved continued funding for the program, effectively making the integration protocols permanent fixtures of special operations training rather than temporary experiments. Torres received communication from the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School that her after-action report had been incorporated into the curriculum as a case study in tactical decision-making under pressure. But more significantly, enrollment applications from female Marines had increased 47% since her Bronze Star ceremony. The visibility of her success had created permission for others to pursue similar paths. She received letters from some of those applicants, young Marines, asking for advice on preparation and training. Torres responded to each one with the same message. The standard is the standard. Gender doesn't change ballistics, and excellence comes from dedicated practice rather than natural talent. Work harder than everyone else expects. Trust your training when pressure arrives, and never let anyone's dismissiveness become your limitation. Kessler completed his assignment at the Training Directorate with performance evaluations that acknowledged his substantive contribution to integration protocol development. Admiral Hartley reviewed those evaluations along with Vance's assessment of whether Kessler's change was genuine or performed. He's done the work, Vance reported, not just completing requirements, but actively contributing to solutions. He's used his failure as a teaching tool, helped develop scenarios that force commanders to confront biases, and demonstrated consistent change in how he evaluates expertise. I recommend continued service with reassignment to operational planning. Hartley made the decision that would determine Kessler's future. You're being reassigned to operational planning at Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command. You'll work directly with Major Torres in that capacity. Your past failure will be known to everyone you work with. Your future depends on demonstrating that failure taught you permanently. Understood? Yes, sir, Kessler replied. I understand completely. The assignment was both opportunity and test. Kessler would work alongside the person whose expertise he dismissed, whose performance had saved his team, and whose experience had triggered systemic change. The arrangement would be uncomfortable, which made it appropriate. Growth came from discomfort rather than comfort. At bases across multiple continents, special operations teams conducted training evolutions using the new protocols. Female operators participated in percentages that reflected capability rather than artificial limitations or quotas. Intelligence analysts, regardless of gender, saw their assessments integrated into tactical planning when those assessments were accurate. The cultural shift was incomplete and uneven, but it was real and measurable. 1 year after Torres had fired 23 rounds to save 7 lives, the special operations community was different in ways that would have seemed impossible before that mission. The change wasn't complete. Decades of cultural conditioning didn't disappear in 12 months. But the direction was clear, the momentum was established, and the standards were being applied more fairly than they had been in the past. Torres understood she'd become part of something larger than individual achievement. Her performance had been exceptional, but the real impact came from how that performance had been used to force examination of systemic failures. She was comfortable with that legacy, recognizing that lasting change required both individual excellence and institutional willingness to learn from that excellence rather than dismiss it. 18 months after the Afghanistan operation, Torres sat on a mountain overlooked near Camp Pendleton, the California peaks reminding her of the terrain where everything had changed. The Pacific stretched beyond the base perimeter, vast and indifferent to the human struggles that played out along its shores. She brought her M110 for routine maintenance. The the ritual familiar and centering after weeks of staff meetings and policy discussions. The rifle represented something more than a weapon now. It was a reminder of 23 shots that had altered how an entire community evaluated expertise and integrated capability. Her phone vibrated with a message from Colonel Vance. The investigation had finally been closed with formal findings published across all Special Operations commands. The report was comprehensive and unsparing, documenting not just the Afghanistan incident, but the broader pattern of dismissed expertise that had cost lives and mission success across multiple operations. Torres read through the executive summary. The findings confirmed what she'd experienced directly: systemic failures in expertise evaluation, command decisions influenced by prejudice rather than performance, and tactical vulnerabilities created by dismissing qualified assessments. The report made 17 specific recommendations, all of which had already been implemented through the integration protocols developed over the past year and a half. But what caught her attention was the personal impact section. The report specifically named her performance as the catalyst for change, describing her tactical decisions and engagement statistics in detail that would be read by thousands of current and future special operations personnel. Her name would be permanently associated with this moment of cultural transformation. She wasn't entirely comfortable with that visibility. Torres had never sought to be a symbol or a case study. She'd simply wanted to do her job well, to apply her skills where they mattered, and to serve without the constant weight of proving herself to people whose prejudices shouldn't have mattered in the first place. Colonel Vance appeared on the trail below, hiking up to Torres's position with the purposeful stride of someone who'd located exactly who she was looking for. The colonel reached the overlook and stood quietly for a moment, looking out over the ocean before speaking. "I want to talk to you in person before the report goes fully public," Vance said. "You're going to face more attention, more interviews, more requests to speak about your experience. I need you to understand what you've become to people across the military." Torres didn't respond immediately, her hands still working through the rifle maintenance routine. "Ma'am, I never wanted to be a symbol. I wanted to be an operator." Vance sat down on a nearby rock. "I understand that, but you need to consider something else. How many young women are looking at your performance and seeing permission they didn't have before? How many are deciding right now to pursue paths they thought were closed to them because you demonstrated those paths are open to anyone with the skill and dedication to walk them?" Torres had received enough letters from aspiring female Marines to know Vance was describing reality rather than speculation. But the weight of other people's expectations felt different than the weight of her own rifle, less tangible but somehow heavier. "I'm not comfortable being used as inspiration," Torres said quietly. "People should pursue these careers because they want to, not because I did something noteworthy." Vance's expression softened. "You're missing the point. They do want to pursue these careers. They always did. But many of them didn't believe they'd be allowed to succeed, or that their expertise would be valued if they did succeed. You proved that excellence can't be dismissed indefinitely. That matters more than you realize." Torres continued her maintenance routine, considering Vance's words against her own experience. She thought about the young Marine who'd written asking if the prejudice was worth enduring, and Torres's response: "The mission is worth it. The capability you develop is worth it, and slowly the system becomes worth it as it learns to recognize what's always been there. Ma'am, if I'm going to be a symbol, then I want to be the right kind of symbol. Not the exceptional woman who proves women can compete. Just an operator who did the job well when it mattered. The fact that my gender made that noteworthy is a failure of the system, not a success to celebrate." Vance smiled at that. "That's exactly the perspective that will make you effective when you speak about this. You're not asking for special recognition. You're pointing out that special recognition shouldn't be necessary for doing your job competently. That message is more powerful than inspiration narratives." Torres finished her rifle cleaning and began reassembly. She'd received orders that morning for her next assignment: Marine Corps Force's Special Operations Command Headquarters, working in operational planning alongside Kessler and others whose careers had been reshaped by that morning in Afghanistan. The position would give her direct influence over how missions were planned and how expertise was integrated into tactical decisions. What happens with Kessler will be interesting, Vance observed, following Torres's thoughts. He's done the work to understand his failures, but working directly with you will test whether that understanding is permanent or performative. Torres had considered that dynamic already. Sir, if he's been assigned to the same command, that means someone believes he's learned the lesson. I'm willing to work with anyone who evaluates expertise fairly, regardless of their history. That's professionalism, Vance said, but it's also giving him more grace than he gave you. Torres smiled slightly. Maybe, but growth requires someone willing to recognize it when it happens. If he's changed, then the system worked the way it should. If he hasn't, that will become clear quickly enough. She thought about Morrison, who deployed twice since completing his integration training, both times working effectively with diverse teams, and sending Torres occasional updates about missions where female analysts or operators had made critical contributions. His transformation seemed genuine, demonstrated through consistent behavior rather than single gestures. The question was whether the broader culture could change at the same pace as motivated individuals. The integration protocols were now doctrine, but doctrine didn't automatically change hearts and minds. Some commanders would embrace the changes because they recognized the operational benefits. Others would comply minimally while maintaining their prejudices privately. And a few would resist openly until forced to retire or adapt. Vance stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. Admiral Hartley wants you to speak at the next Special Operations Forces Industry Conference. It's attended by senior leadership across all Special Operations commands and defense industry partners. Your perspective on tactical decision-making and expertise integration would be valuable. Torres considered the request. Ma'am, I'll speak if ordered, but I prefer my impact come through my work rather than my words. Sometimes your words are part of your work, Vance replied. These are people who need to hear directly from someone who lived the consequences of dismissed expertise. Not through briefings or reports, but from the operator who had to save teammates because command failures put them at risk. That carries weight that policy documents never will. Torres recognized the logic even as she remained uncomfortable with the visibility. All right, ma'am, I'll do it. But I'm speaking as an operator sharing tactical lessons, not as a diversity advocate making inspirational points. Vance smiled. That's exactly what makes you the right person to deliver the message. Your credibility comes from competence, not advocacy. People listen differently when a messenger earned their platform through performance rather than politics. After Vance left, Torres remained on the overlook, watching the sun track across the sky toward evening. She thought about the mountains in Afghanistan, the courtyard where 7 people had been pinned down, and the 23 shots that had somehow become about more than just saving lives in that specific moment. She'd never wanted to prove that women could operate at elite levels. She'd simply wanted to operate at elite levels herself, to apply her skills where they mattered most. But history didn't care what you wanted. It recorded what you did and let others interpret the meaning. Torres had fired 23 rounds and changed the culture. The question now was what she would do with the platform that performance had created. She could minimize her visibility and focus purely on operational work. Or she could accept that her experience carried lessons others needed to hear, and that sharing those lessons might be as important as any mission she'd execute in the future. She packed her rifle and began the hike back to base, still uncertain about the answer, but recognizing that uncertainty was acceptable. Growth didn't require certainty. It required willingness to move forward despite discomfort, to accept roles you hadn't chosen because they needed filling, and to recognize that sometimes the mission was larger than individual preference. The California mountains surrounded her as she walked, different from Afghanistan, but teaching similar lessons about patience, precision, and a long view that separated temporary discomfort from permanent change. 2 years after the Afghanistan operation, the first fully integrated special operations team deployed to a crisis zone in East Africa. The team included operators selected purely on performance metrics, with gender as irrelevant to selection as height or eye color. 3 women served among 12 personnel, their specialties ranging from intelligence analysis to direct action to combat medicine. Torres watched the deployment brief from her position at Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command Headquarters, reviewing the mission parameters with the analytical precision that had defined her career. The operation was complex, requiring coordination across multiple specialties and adaptation to fluid tactical situations. Exactly the kind of mission where integrated expertise would prove its value or reveal its limitations. The team commander was a Marine lieutenant colonel who'd completed the integration training 18 months earlier. His mission brief reflected the cultural changes that had become doctrine. Expertise was identified by specialty and experience without reference to gender. Tactical positions were assigned based on capability rather than assumption, and the brief explicitly noted that all assessments would be evaluated on merit regardless of source. Major Torres, the commander, said during the video conference, "I've read your after-action report from Afghanistan probably 20 times. It shaped how I approach tactical planning and expertise integration. Any guidance for this operation?" Torres considered her response carefully. "Sir, trust your people's assessments in their areas of expertise. When someone with specialized knowledge provides input that conflicts with your initial plan, that's information worth integrating rather than dismissing. The mission succeeds or fails based on how well you utilize all available capability, not just the capabilities you expected to rely on." The commander acknowledged the guidance and concluded the brief. Torres watched the video feed end, recognizing that this deployment represented the ultimate test of everything that had changed over the past 2 years. Policy and training were one thing. Combat operations were the reality that revealed whether those changes were substantive or superficial. At the JSOC Operations Center, Admiral Hartley monitored the East Africa deployment alongside other active missions. He'd made integration protocols his personal priority, using his authority to ensure implementation was comprehensive rather than token. The results had exceeded his expectations. Measurable improvements in mission success rates, reduced tactical errors, and operational effectiveness that validated the approach. But Hartley knew that sustained cultural change required more than successful deployments. It required generational shifts in who entered special operations and what standards they were held to. The integration protocols had opened doors, but those doors would only stay open if the people walking through them continued to demonstrate the kind of excellence Torres had exemplified. He pulled up her service record again, reviewing the trajectory from Scout Sniper to Bronze Star recipient to Field Grade Officer, influencing policy at the operational level. Torres had become exactly what the special operations community needed: proof that capability existed independent of expectations, and a voice within the system advocating for fair evaluation of expertise. Hartley drafted a memo to the Secretary of Defense recommending Torres for promotion to lieutenant colonel ahead of her normal timeline. Her technical skills remained valuable, but her strategic impact on special operations culture made her irreplaceable at higher levels of leadership. The memo detailed her performance, her role in triggering systemic change, and her continued contribution to integration protocol development. At Quantico, the Scout Sniper School conducted qualification exercises for the latest class of students. 4 women were among the 26 candidates, all held to identical standards with no accommodation or exception. 2 of them had written to Torres months earlier asking for advice. She'd responded with the same message she gave everyone: the standard is the standard, work harder than people expect, and never let doubt become limitation. The lead instructor watched one of the female candidates execute a complex firing solution at 1,100 meters, compensating for wind, elevation, and temperature with calculations that produced a first-round hit. The shot would have impressed him regardless of who made it, which was exactly the point. Excellence was excellence, and recognizing it didn't require special consideration or lowered standards. After the qualification, the instructor submitted his assessment using language that would have been impossible 2 years earlier. Candidate demonstrates exceptional aptitude for precision shooting with performance metrics, placing her in top 5% of all students regardless of gender. Recommend immediate assignment to operational unit upon completion of training. The assessment evaluated capability without caveat or qualification, which represented cultural progress more than any policy document. Torres received notification that the East Africa mission had concluded successfully. The team had adapted to complex tactical situations, integrated intelligence from multiple sources, and accomplished objectives without casualties. The after-action report specifically noted that a female intelligence analyst pattern recognition had identified an enemy position that the team's initial assessment had missed, preventing a potential ambush. The report circulated through Special Operations Commands as another data point confirming what Torres's performance had initially demonstrated. Integration improved rather than degraded operational capability when expertise was evaluated fairly. The evidence was accumulating beyond the point where skeptics could dismiss it as anomaly or exception. Kessler appeared at Torres's office door at the Marine Corps Special Operations Command headquarters, carrying mission planning documents for her review. They'd been working together for 6 months, their professional relationship defined by mutual respect earned through consistent performance rather than past history. Major Torres, I need your assessment on these overwatch positions for the pending operation, Kessler said, spreading maps across her desk. I've identified 3 potential locations, but I want your expertise on which provides optimal coverage. Torres studied the terrain, analyzing elevation, ranges, and fields of fire with the same precision she'd applied in Afghanistan. She marked her recommendation and explained the tactical reasoning. Kessler listened without defensiveness or dismissiveness, integrating her assessment into the operational plan because the assessment was accurate regardless of who provided it. Their working relationship demonstrated what cultural change looked like at the individual level. Past failures acknowledged, lessons learned permanently, and behavior change through consistent choice rather than temporary performance. Kessler would never fully escape his history, but he'd proven capable of growth beyond it. Morrison visited Torres during a temporary assignment at the same headquarters. He'd been promoted to Chief Petty Officer and was serving as Senior Enlisted Advisor for Integration Training across Naval Special Warfare. His transformation from hostile team member to advocate for fair expertise evaluation represented the kind of individual change that enabled broader cultural shifts. They sat in the headquarters cafeteria, Morrison describing his current assignment and the resistance he still encountered from some operators who viewed integration as political correctness rather than operational improvement. I tell them the same story every time, Morrison said. I tell them about being pinned down in that courtyard, wounded teammates, and a Marine sniper saving our lives while I'd spent the previous 12 hours treating her like a liability. Usually shuts down the arguments pretty quick. Torres appreciated his willingness to own his failures publicly. That story carries more weight coming from you than it would from me, she said. People need to hear from someone who made the mistakes and learned from them. Morrison nodded. I owe you more than one story. I owe you my life and the perspective to see past prejudice to capability. That's a debt I'm still working to repay. At the Special Operations Forces Industry Conference, Torres delivered her presentation to an audience of senior military leadership and defense industry partners. She spoke about tactical decision-making under pressure, the cost of dismissed expertise, and how fair evaluation of capability improved operational effectiveness. Her credibility came from combat performance rather than advocacy, which gave her words weight that policy briefings never achieved. The presentation included her Afghanistan engagement statistics, not to emphasize personal achievement, but to demonstrate what became possible when expertise was recognized and utilized rather than dismissed. 23 rounds, 21 confirmed hits, 7 lives saved, and a catalyst for cultural transformation that was still unfolding 2 years later. After the presentation, multiple senior officers approached with questions and comments. Several admitted they'd initially been skeptical of integration protocols, but had seen measurable improvements in their commands after implementation. The data was convincing in ways that arguments about fairness never were. Better mission outcomes, fewer preventable errors, and operational effectiveness that proved integration was strategic advantage rather than social experiment. Torres returned to her office that evening, reviewing upcoming mission plans and integration assessments that would determine policy refinements. She thought about the question someone had asked after her presentation. Do you consider yourself a role model for women in special operations? Her answer had been immediate. I consider myself an operator who did the job well when it mattered. And if that gives other people permission to pursue similar paths, that's a positive outcome, but not my primary purpose. She pulled out a letter that had arrived that morning from a young Marine attending Scout Sniper School, one of the women whose qualification she'd watched through reports and statistics. The letter expressed gratitude for making the path possible, for proving that excellence could overcome prejudice, for demonstrating that capability mattered more than expectations. Torres drafted her response with the same message she always shared. Trust your training, maintain your standards, and never let anyone's dismissiveness define your limitations. The path isn't easy, but worthwhile things rarely are. Excellence is excellence regardless of who achieves it, and the only validation that matters comes from performing well when performance counts. She looked at the photo on her desk from that Afghanistan operation. 7 SEALs alive, because 23 shots had been fired with precision when precision was the difference between survival and catastrophe. The photo reminded her that everything else, all the recognition and policy changes and cultural transformation, was secondary to the simple fact that people were alive who might not have been. That remained the only metric that ultimately mattered, the only standard worth maintaining, and the only legacy worth building. Not inspiration or symbol or catalyst for change, but operator who did the job well when teammates needed it most. If that performance happened to change a culture, then the culture had been ready for change and simply needed someone to demonstrate what was possible when expertise was evaluated fairly rather than dismissed unfairly. Torres filed her mission planning documents and prepared for the next operation, the next assessment, the next opportunity to prove that excellence was excellence regardless of expectations. The work continued because the mission continued, and she never needed any other purpose beyond doing that work as well as anyone possibly could.